Hi, everyone, and welcome to Chapter 7 lecture from my kitchen. I know that this is a time of uncertainty and we're not sure what's going on, but we're just going to play it by ear each week. I know that it seems a little daunting to think that you'll be completing some of the work online, but I'm right here and I'll always help. I'll be bringing you lectures like this, and then we can also talk on Facebook, Blackboard Messages. Because I'm home, you're going to see interesting things like Pickles the cat. There he is. But we're going to do our best just to cover the content just like we would in class and continue with the assignments. As we hear more about what's going on in terms of long-term planning for the rest of the semester, I'll be updating the course calendar as needed, and I will explain everything thoroughly as we go. So today what we're going to talk about are nonverbal messages. This is chapter 7 of our textbook. So if you'll remember back to our last lecture, we talked about the verbal message, and we defined the verbal message as our written language, our spoken language, or our signed language. And the nonverbal message basically covers everything else. The nonverbal message, according to your textbook, is defined as behavior other than written or spoken words that creates meaning for someone else. So a nonverbal message is basically everything else we do in communication that isn't specifically language-based. Some things we need to know about the nonverbal message is, number one, they tend to be a little bit ambiguous. If you remember, that word ambiguous means unclear. So we don't have like a dictionary that says this is what happy looks like, and this is what sad looks like, and this is what disgust looks like, and this is what anger looks like. Now, we do have some characteristics that tend to be similar, but for the most part, each of our faces can look different. This could be their happy face, and this could be their sad face, and this could be their confused face. And for others, happy is happy, and sad is sad, and confused is confused. So it really does vary from each person. And because it can vary, it is termed ambiguous or unclear. Something else we need to know about the nonverbal message is that it is continuous. So for our verbal message, it has a clear start and stop. We start, and my phone is ringing. Hold on. We start the verbal message when we start talking, and we stop the verbal message when we stop talking. But for our nonverbal messages, this is pretty different. Our nonverbal message is communicating continuously. As long as someone is looking at us, they can get a nonverbal message from us. This means that we don't necessarily have to even think about communicating a nonverbal message. Someone can get a nonverbal message from us if they're just watching us. If you've ever sat and looked out a window and people watched, or sat on a bench, or just saw someone walking across campus, you are getting a nonverbal message from them, and they don't even know you're looking at them. So nonverbal messages are continuous, meaning that they do not have a clear start and stop point. Nonverbal messages are also multi-channeled. This means there's a lot of different outlets that we use at the same time for the nonverbal message. As we'll talk about the communication codes later in the lecture, a nonverbal message can be our a nonverbal message can be our face, it can be our eyes, it can be our posture, it can be our gestures. So there's a lot of different things that our nonverbals can communicate at the same time. So they're multi-channeled. And lastly, nonverbal messages are culturally based. If we don't know this already, cultures do things differently, and one of those things is the nonverbal message. So someone might smile big and open mouth, and that would be their normal happy face. In other cultures, that would be very odd, and their happy face is a closed mouth smile. The classic example is when President Nixon was on a peacekeeping mission in South America. Before after visiting all of these countries, he went and did the peace sign and got in his airplane and flew away. And the peace sign was equivalent to the middle finger in those countries. And it was like the president of the United States came and flicked them off. But for us, the peace sign means happiness, and it is a positive message. So we can see that nonverbal messages are culturally based. So next, what I want to talk about is the importance of nonverbal messages. We can sometimes discount or not think about the nonverbal message as much as we would the verbal message, but it's important to consider the nonverbal message. So why is it important? Number one, nonverbal messages are the primary ways that we communicate feelings and attitudes. According to your textbook and Albert Morabian, only 7% of our emotions is communicated verbally. So our emotions, 93% of the time, are communicated non-verbally. And if we look at the breakdown of that 93%, the two most important nonverbal expressors of emotions and feelings, number one, of course, is the face. According to your textbook, 55% of our emotions are expressed, there's the cat, through our face. And so our face is a rich expressor of emotions. And another part of that 93% is our voice. According to your textbook, 38% of our emotional expression is communicated through our voice. And that includes pitch and volume and tone and speed. So that's really important to consider when we're looking at the nonverbal message and its communication impact on feelings and emotions. So number two, the reason that nonverbal communication is important is that they tend to be more believable. So nonverbal messages tend to be more believable than the verbal message. And if we can think about this, there's some things about the nonverbal message that we cannot control. So blushing or sweating or our hands shaking if we're nervous. These are things that we don't have a lot of control over. They're just our body's natural expressions. And because of that, we often intuitively know that the nonverbal message tends to be more believable than the verbal message. So the three primary places that we look to get information about nonverbal expressions are our hands, our feet, and our face. And I realize while I'm teaching public speaking classes, if someone's nervous, they can often contain their nervousness in a couple of ways, but it can leak out. So they might look cool as a cucumber on their face, but their hands are shaking. Or they have a leg that's just going 90 miles an hour. Or their face is blushed or flushed. And so there's ways that we understand that the nonverbal message is more believable because it's less controllable. Also, the nonverbal message can be more believable because, like we said a minute ago, it's multi-channeled. That means that there's lots of different places for the nonverbals to come out all at the same time. And because of that, it's hard to control them all. So we trust them more. The number three reason why nonverbal messages are important is that nonverbal messages work together with the verbal message to create meaning. And it does this in many ways. So our nonverbal and our verbal messages work together. So one way they do this is through substituting. And this is where we replace the nonverbal message instead of the verbal message. So if you were to ask me, Mrs. Winkler, how many children do you have? And I hold up one finger, that's telling you that I have one child, but I didn't say anything with my verbal message. I just used my nonverbal expressor, my hand, and that is how we substitute. The second way they work together, the verbal and nonverbal message, is to repeat. And that's where my verbal and nonverbal message says the same thing. So, for example, if you were to ask me, Mrs. Winkler, how many children do you have? I hold up one finger and I say, I have one child. My verbal and my nonverbals are saying the same thing. Third is that they contradict. And so this is where our nonverbal says one thing and our verbal says something else. So for example, if you were to ask me, Mrs. Winkler, how many children do you have? And I hold up one finger, but I say I have 3 children. which one is it? The verbal or the nonverbal? And so that's to contradict. Number 4 is to regulate the flow of conversation. And this is where we use this a lot to tell other people that we want to speak, or to let someone know we are done speaking or we're done talking in the conversation. So something like looking at our watch and saying, wow, look at the time, could be an example of a regulatory way. We use our verbal and our nonverbals to say the same thing, to regulate the flow of conversation. Or I could be like, well, what do you think? And that way I'm using my hand and I'm saying the same thing to have you enter into the conversation, to regulate the flow. Also, we use the nonverbals to work together with the verbals to accent. And accenting is where we reinforce words. So if I say something and like, you need to know this right now. So I say the words, but I clap to add emphasis. That's an accent, to bring focus to certain words that we're trying to communicate. And lastly is to compliment. Compliment with an E, not an I. So it isn't like you look nice today. A compliment is where we express emotions. So it's where my verbal is saying something and my nonverbal expresses the emotion behind it. So if I say, I'm really sorry that you're going through this, and my eyes get really sparkly and maybe there's a tear in my eye. So I'm showing nonverbally the emotion behind my verbal message. So we've talked about 3 different ways that the nonverbal message is important. There's 2 more I want to hit on. Number 4 is that nonverbal messages help us to respond and adapt to others. And so we think about our nonverbal message from our standpoint a lot, but we also need to think about the nonverbal message from someone else's standpoint. There's a theory that your book introduces here called interaction adaptation theory. And this theory says that people interact with others by adapting their communication behaviors. And they use a term called interactional synchrony. So what's happening here is we will adapt or change our nonverbals to mirror or to look the same as the nonverbals of the person that we're talking to. So if that person is leaning forward in conversation, we'll lean forward. If that person has their arms crossed, we might also cross our arms. If that person is smiling, we'll smile. And by doing this, mirroring, it helps to build relationship and helps to build connection and helps that other person to know that they're a valued part of our relationships. And lastly, nonverbal messages play a major role in interpersonal relationships. Oh, yes. So our feelings and attitudes are expressed non-verbally for the most part. We just looked at the interaction adaptation theory that says we'll mirror our nonverbals to match someone else's to create connection and bond. So no wonder our nonverbal message is so important in our interpersonal relationships. According to your textbook, 65% of our social or relational meaning is communicated nonverbally. So over half of the time, 65% of the time, we are telling someone how we feel about them through our nonverbal message rather than our verbal message. We will say things like, I love you, but our actions often speak louder than our words, if you've ever heard that cliche. And that's true, meaning that people are more likely to get emotional meaning through our nonverbals than they are through our verbal message. Okay, so now that we talked about the importance of the nonverbal message, next and last, it's a kind of long section, we're going to talk about the nonverbal communication codes. And so when we say, as we define the nonverbal message is everything but the verbal message, what on earth does that mean? So there are some categories I want to touch on. Number 1, under nonverbal communication codes, is body movement and posture. Kinesics is the study of body movement and posture. Pickles the cat, go away. There we go. So kinesics, if you've taken a kinesiology class, kinesics is the root of that word, and it's the study of movement and gestures. Your book talks about the importance of our body in our nonverbal messages, and it defines several different ways that our nonverbal message communicates through our body and posture. One is called emblems, and emblems are nonverbal cues that have specific, generally understood meanings in a given culture and may substitute a word or phrase. So instead of saying hi, that is an emblem. There's Pickles. Second are illustrators, and an illustrator is a nonverbal behavior that accompanies a verbal message and either contradicts it, accents it, or complements it. Just like we talked about a few minutes ago, an illustrator helps to elaborate on the verbal message. Number 3 are affect displays, and an affect display is how we communicate emotions. So the primary way we communicate emotions is through our voice and our face, like we talked about a few minutes ago. And affect displays add emotion to our verbal message. Number 4 are regulators, like we talked about a few minutes ago. These are nonverbal messages to control the flow of conversation between two people. So the more I look at you, the more you're going to be cued that it's your turn to talk. If I lean in and listen, tilt my head, I'm saying, hey, I'm listening to you. That's regulating the flow of conversation. And lastly, we have adapters. And an adapter is a nonverbal behavior that satisfies a personal need or helps another person. So an adapter could be me straightening my clothes, or going like this if I'm cold. An adapter might be helping someone up. An adapter might be handing something to someone. So these are the things we do with our body to take care of ourselves and others. So the second nonverbal communication code is eye contact. Eye contact is, so we're just focusing in on our eyeballs on this communication code. And our eyes communicate a lot of different messages depending on the culture in which we live. Eye contact is definitely culturally based. So what I'm going to talk about is the North American standard for eye contact, because we tend to have very direct eye contact, and some cultures do not have direct eye contact. So according to your book, there are 4 functions of eye contact. Number 1 is the cognitive function. And this tries to understand what someone is thinking. So have you ever been listening to someone talk and you lean in and you squint like, what is that person saying? That is the cognitive function. We are trying to take in very specific details of the nonverbal message to help their verbal message make sense to us. We're trying to understand cognitively what they are thinking. The second function is the monitor function, and this is to monitor the other person's response to us. If you'll remember at the beginning of the semester, we talked about the looking glass self, and the looking glass self says we watch other people and how they respond to us, and their response tells us something about ourselves. That is this monitoring function. It also helps to regulate the flow of conversation. It also helps to tell someone that we're listening. It also helps to tell someone that we are confused or happy or sad about their message by looking at their response, by monitoring what they are looking like when we're communicating with them. Number 3 is the regulatory feature. Again, we use our eyes to help regulate the flow of conversation. If I'm ready to be done talking to you, I might start looking at other things. And the lack of eye contact is a cue that says this conversation needs to move along or needs to be over, or the information that I'm talking about is really personal or hard, and it helps to tell us more about that conversation. And lastly, our eyes are used, the last function is the expressive function. And this, if you've ever seen the eyes or the mirror of the soul, it is really just, it's communicating emotions. We can see so much of what someone is feeling through their eyes, whether they sparkle or whether they're squinty or whether they're downcast or whether they're red or whether they're red rimmed like someone's been crying. So we learn a lot about emotions through eye contact as well. Research says that we look at other things besides the speaker's eyes 57% of the time. So even when we're in conversation, we are not using staring direct eye contact. We also look around at other things to help think. The third nonverbal communication code are facial expressions. Whew. And this can cover so much. It includes the forehead, the eyebrows, the bottom or below the eyes, the nose, the cheekbones, the upper lip, the bottom lip, the coloring of our skin. So much is included in a facial expression category. According to your textbook, there are over 250,000 different emotions that a person can express with their face. Your book says that women tend to be more facially expressive than men, but we all share 6 primary facial expressions, and they are surprise, fear, disgust, anger, happiness, and sadness. These tend to be universal facial expressions. And then we can kind of morph some of them depending on like how disgusted we are or how happy we are. Are we elated? Are we like just so happy we can't stand it? Are we just happy? Are we sort of happy? So there's different degrees of each one of those facial expressions as well. So that was number 3, facial expressions. Number 4 are vocal cues. And our voice tells something a lot about us. We can guess a person's personality, power, credibility, and even parts of their sexuality depending on their vocal cues. Vocal cues also communicate emotion. Joy and anger tend to be the easiest to hear in someone's voice, whereas shame or love are some of the most difficult types of emotions to understand through our voice. Voice also helps us to manage conversation. Your book defines a term called back channel cues. And a back channel cue is a signal that you wish to speak or stopped speaking. So these are things that we use with our voice to say, I want to talk or I do not want to talk. For example, when we're done talking, we typically lower our pitch. So I might say, okay, good to see you. See you again soon. Soon goes down. And that's saying, hey, I'm done talking. So the pitch is communicating the flow of conversation. Back channel cues can be very helpful when we're talking on the phone because we miss most of the nonverbal message when we're on the phone. The back channel cues will help to tell someone we're talking or we're waiting for them to talk. Interestingly enough, silence is also a part of voice. It's the lack of voice. And silence has a positive effect and a negative effect. For example, a positive silence is just, the feeling you get of comfort, meaning feeling like you don't always have to fill the relationship with conversation. It's okay to be quiet. It's okay to have silence. That's like a positive or comfortable silence. Stonewalling is the opposite of positive silence. And this is where we try to shut someone out, ignore them, give them the silent treatment in order to communicate something non-verbally. This is, your book says, often a symptom of a stressed relationship. So there's one more communication code that I want to talk about, and that is personal space. Personal space. We all kind of walk around with this bubble that we're wearing. And the bubble says, this is where I'm comfortable having people stop in relationship to my body. And our bubbles are different. Some people have really big bubbles and they want a lot of personal space. And some people don't have big bubbles. They tend to be more touchy-feely. Cultures also very much can impact personal space. So some cultures are very in your space, and some cultures have a large personal space bubble. North Americans, for the most part, have a larger personal space need, especially in Texas, because we have room. We aren't jam-packed in as a community, and so we have space, and we can give others space, and we expect space. You might meet someone who comes from a more dense populated area like New York or LA, and they tend to stand a lot closer together just because there's not a lot of room to spread out. That's personal space. Now, a vocab word, proxemics, is the study of personal space and how we position ourselves in relationship to others to help feel safe in our space. So there are 4 zones of personal space, and this was written by Edward Hall, and it's in your book. And it says that there's different relationships that we will allow into different spaces that we have. The first space is the intimate space, and this is from skin-to-skin contact to 18 inches away from your body. And these are like doctors will enter this space, dentists will enter this space, people who cut our hair will enter this space. And then there are some family members like kids or a spouse or a significant other that will enter this space. And when they do, it doesn't cause us alarm because we know they're there for a reason. The second space is personal space, and this is 18 inches to 4 feet. Most of our interpersonal communication happens in the personal space realm. So it's far enough away not to be like right up in your touching your body, but they're close enough that you can have a personal conversation and not everybody is hearing it. It's not broadcasted out. So friends and family tend to be in this space. The third space zone is the social space, and this is 4 feet to 12 feet. And the social space is kind of like what we might have in a classroom, or what might happen if you're out with friends at a barbecue in the backyard, or if you're at a restaurant. So social space. This is where you're not going to know everyone that's in this space, and you're comfortable with strangers being around you in the social space because it doesn't seem threatening or too invasive. And lastly is public space, and this is 12 feet and beyond. This is usually like a speaker with an audience space. It's very difficult for 2 people to communicate 12 feet apart and have anything meaningful because it's so far apart. So we use this to maybe deliver speeches, or when we go to church, it's a public space, or when we go to a campaign event, you're going to be listening to the speaker speak in a public space. There's a couple other nonverbal communication codes that you can read in your book. Territory, that's really interesting. Touch, and appearance. Lastly, very quickly, I want to talk about ways that we can think about improving our nonverbal expressions. Because I often hear students say, someone always thought that I was mad, and I'm not mad, it's just my face. Or people think I'm snobbish when they first meet me. I don't know why that is. Well, it's probably our nonverbal message. So here are a couple tips for thinking about how we express nonverbally. Number 1, be mindful and aware about your expressions. Number 2, look at others and see how they're reacting to you. And if they're reacting in a way that you are not intending them to react, maybe it's because our nonverbal message is communicating something other than what we had planned. Number 3, ask others about impressions. So ask others, how do you think I'm feeling when I say this? Or what does my face look like it's telling you right now? And then lastly, practice. Practice our nonverbal expressions, and they will become more clear. So that's a little bit about nonverbal messages. I'm going to post a couple other videos that talk about the journal that's coming up and some other things that are going to be happening this semester. But I wanted just right now to talk to you a little bit about the nonverbal message. This information is in your textbook and it will be on exam 2. So I want you to be prepared even if we don't get to see each other for a little bit. So send me a message if you have any questions and we'll talk soon. Bye.